So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the endocrine system and the nervous system. So let's go ahead and begin. We're going to start with the endocrine system. So, the endocrine system is basically the system that deals with glands and hormones. And why are hormones needed? Why does our body use hormones for regulation? Well, hormones are basically chemical messengers or messages. They're chemical molecules that your body cells recognize as messages. And a gland is going to release the hormone and use it to communicate to another part of the body. And so it's going to be used as communication. The hormone itself is going to be used as communication. And those hormones are going to help you regulate. We're going to be talking about several solutes, several ways that our body maintains homeostasis and regulation using these hormones. So, for example, solute levels in blood, such as glucose, such as calcium, salts, etc. And then also we use hormones to regulate metabolism, growth, development, maturation, and reproduction. So hormones are required for all of these regulated processes. All right, and like I said, in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the endocrine system and the nervous system. So animals, our bodies rely on two systems for regulation. That's the endocrine system and the nervous system. And the endocrine system is a system of ductless glands. So these glands are going to produce hormones, and then those hormones are going to be released into the bloodstream. So they're going to be secreted directly into the blood. And the bloodstream is going to carry those hormones to target tissues. So wherever there are receptors for those hormones, that will be the target tissue. And so, as I was saying, those target tissues, those cells are going to have receptor proteins that are specific for those hormones. And the endocrine system is considered, when compared to the nervous system, it's considered to be slow, a long-lasting response. Whereas the nervous system is a service system of neurons. So here is a diagram showing a neuron, and we'll definitely talk more about how neurons work. And they will transmit an electrical signal. Okay, and electrical signals are basically negative charges that move along a space. So it's going to transmit electrical signals and release neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters are going to be that chemical signal, right? So this is part one of our discussion of cell communication, and the ligand that we've been talking about, the ligand, which is the signal, right? With the nervous system, it's the neurotransmitters that are those ligands, which are those signals. Whereas with the endocrine system, the ligand, the signals, are hormones, okay? So keep that in mind. This is part one of our discussion of cell communication. In the endocrine system, it's hormones that are the ligand, the signal molecules. Whereas in the nervous system, it is the neurotransmitters, okay? And those neurotransmitters are going to go to target tissue, just like how hormones through the blood travel to target tissue. And the nervous system is considered to be very fast, short-lasting response. And I will be giving you an example about reflexes. Reflexes, as you know, are very fast, short responses. Okay? So again, we've been talking about cell communication using ligands, using chemical messengers. In the nervous system, those chemical messengers or ligands or chemical signals are neurotransmitters. And in the endocrine system, those chemical messengers, ligands or signals, are hormones. And they both will bind to receptor proteins. Okay? So when we compare a neuron with the endocrine system, an electrical impulse is going to move down the axon. And when the electrical impulse reaches what we call the axon terminal, it's going to cause neurotransmitters to be released. Whereas in the endocrine system, the gland is producing hormones, and those hormones will go directly into the blood and be carried through the bloodstream to target tissue. And both neurotransmitters and hormones, they will bind to target tissues where there are receptors. And it's a lot like the lock and key system, where the signal molecules will bind to the receptor. Okay? So let's talk about hormones. Okay, let's talk about hormones. There are two basic groups of hormones, or two classes of hormones. There's a protein-based hormone, whereas there's the other lipid-based hormone. Okay, so as you guys remember, proteins are made up of amino acids. If they're made up of amino acids, that means that they're going to be polar, right? Because you know you have amino acids that are nonpolar, but then you also have amino acids that are polar. Okay, so overall, we're going to consider proteins to be polar or hydrophilic. Okay, and I apologize, my pen here isn't the greatest. Whenever I'm recording, my pen barely works. Okay, so there are several different kinds of protein-based hormones. There's polypeptides, which are long chains of amino acids, such as insulin, which we're going to be definitely talking about, and then ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone. We're not going to be talking about that today, all right? But basically, it is a hormone that regulates solute concentration in your blood. And then glycoproteins. These are protein-based hormones that are made up of carbohydrates and proteins, and that makes sense, right? Because glyco refers to carbohydrates like glucose and proteins. And some examples of that would be FSH and LH. We'll briefly be discussing them today, but it's follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. They will cause the development of mature sperm and mature eggs in the gonads. And then you have the amines, and amines sounds like amino acids, so we're talking about very simple hormones, very simple hormones, very small hormones, modified amino acids like epinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline, and then melatonin. Okay, we're not going to be discussing melatonin today in great detail. I'll just mention it now that melatonin is actually released by your pineal gland, which is in your brain. Okay, the pineal gland, and it's responsible for circadian rhythms, making you tired and sleepy when it is dark outside. Okay. All right. Next is the lipid-based hormones, and whenever you hear the word lipid, you should automatically think non-polar. You should think hydrophobic, right? Hydrophobic. And these hormones are steroids, such as sex hormones like testosterone, okay, and estrogen. And we will be talking about those today. Oops, estrogen. Aldosterone we won't be talking about in this presentation, but just like ADH, it is responsible for solute concentration in your blood and blood pressure. So how do hormones act on target cells? Okay, for lipid-based hormones, because they are, and again, when you hear the word lipid, you should think nonpolar, you should think hydrophobic, okay? Because they are hydrophobic and nonpolar, they're going to simply enter the cell, bypassing the cell phospholipid bilayer, and bind to a receptor that's in the cytoplasm, okay? So they're hydrophobic and lipid soluble. So if this is a cell, this is our phospholipid bilayer, lipid-based hormones like testosterone and estrogen, they can simply bypass. So I'm going to draw it like this. This is our steroid hormone. Just simply pass through this phospholipid bilayer and then attach to a receptor protein that's in the cytoplasm. And together, the steroid hormone and receptor protein will enter the nucleus where the DNA is, okay? And together, they'll enter the nucleus, and they're going to act as a transcription factor, turning on genes, okay? So when you think about it, testosterone is going to give you masculine characteristics. Estrogen is going to give you more feminine characteristics, and that is due to gene expression, okay? And so the lipid-based hormones are going to target tissues and turn on genes that are going to give you masculine characteristics versus feminine characteristics. Okay, so they're going to diffuse across the cell membrane and enter the cells. They're going to bind to receptor proteins in the cytoplasm and then go into the nucleus, acting as a transcription factor where they're going to turn on the genes. Okay, the genes are going to be turned on, and then proteins for those, proteins specific to those hormones are going to be turned on. Okay, are going to be made. All right, and then protein-based hormones, we're going to think of them as being polar. We're going to think of them as being hydrophilic. Hydrophilic, okay? And because they're hydrophilic, because they're polar, they cannot simply enter the cell membrane. They can't bypass the cell membrane. They have to bind to a protein that is embedded in the phospholipid bilayer, okay? So actually these hormones, they never enter the cell. They never enter their cell. They're always attached to, they will attach to a receptor protein, and then the receptor protein will change conformational shape. It changes shape, and then there's a message that goes inside the cell, okay? Usually it's associated with the phosphorylation cascade, which is going to amplify the response in the cell. So protein-based hormones are hydrophilic and not lipid soluble, so they have to bind to receptor proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane. And it usually triggers a secondary messenger pathway, a signal transduction pathway, as I was stating. And we'll go over some examples of these, okay? Activates internal cellular response. All right, let's talk about lipid steroid hormones like testosterone. So as I said, let me just set this up. So there's our steroid hormone being carried in the blood, and there's our target cell, cytoplasm, and nucleus, okay? And because that steroid hormone is nonpolar, hydrophobic, it can simply bypass the cell membrane, so it's going to cross the cell membrane, bind to a receptor protein that is in the cytoplasm, it's going to enter the nucleus, and it's going to turn on a gene, okay? Turn on a specific gene that testosterone is going to target, okay? So when a gene is turned on, gene expression is taking place in the cell, meaning that gene is going to be transcribed, and in transcription, what is made? mRNA is going to be made, okay? So we have our mRNA, and keep in mind that, remember, when mRNA is made, before it can leave the cytoplasm, what things have to happen to the mRNA? mRNA needs to be processed. I hope you guys remember this. mRNA needs to be processed. Those introns need to come out by the spliceosomes. The spliceosomes are going to cut out those introns. A 5' cap is going to be added. A poly A tail is going to be added to the end. So mRNA needs to be processed before it leaves this, the nucleus. Once that mRNA leaves the nucleus, a ribosome is going to translate the mRNA. Remember, every 3 on an mRNA is called a codon. So that ribosome is going to read the codons and start making a long polypeptide chain. So it's read by the ribosome, and there's our polypeptide chain there. And when I look at that polypeptide chain, it's kind of folded up. So to me, this looks like it's in tertiary structure. So, I'm describing the action of a steroid hormone, but I'm also relating it to, ideas that we've already learned, okay? Like gene transcription and translation, mRNA processing, the levels of protein structure. Remember, you have primary structure, secondary structure, tertiary, and quaternary, okay? And then that protein, once it is made inside the cell, it's going to be secreted outside the cell by exocytosis, okay? So again, this is some stuff that we learned a long time ago. And hopefully this is like a review where you kind of remember, like, oh yeah, I remember that, exocytosis, where the protein is secreted. And so it really depends on the target cell. If the target cell was a hair follicle, then testosterone is going to encourage hair growth, which is keratin. So the keratin protein will be, those genes will be turned on, and keratin protein will be synthesized by transcription translated and secreted by exocytosis. Okay, so it really depends on the target cell. But if it was like a hair follicle, if it was a bone cell, then it would cause, testosterone makes bone density, it increases bone density, muscle density for bigger muscles. That's why a lot of bodybuilders might be taking synthetic testosterone, because it helps build up muscle mass. And then gametes, this might be targeting testes to start making gametes. Okay, so it really depends on the target cell, what testosterone does, but it's going to turn on genes specific to that target cell. Okay. All right, next let's talk about protein hormones. So again, protein hormones, and let me just set this up. We have the target cell, you have the plasma membrane, cytoplasm, and the receptor protein. So because it's a protein, it's made up of amino acids, which can be polar. We're going to think of the protein hormone as being polar and hydrophilic. So it won't be able to come into the cell at all. It's going to bind to a receptor protein, and once it does, right, that receptor protein is going to change shape. Okay? It's going to change shape. And then it's going to activate some kind of signal protein in the cytoplasm. And in this example, it is a G protein. So this is our G protein here. And by the way, this is called a G protein linked receptor because it's related, it's connected to this G protein. Once this receptor protein changes shape, this G protein will detach. It's going to detach and come off and move laterally. And it is energized by GTP. So GTP is it's the molecule that energizes that G protein to move over laterally. That G protein is going to connect with an enzyme and activate that enzyme. And that activated enzyme is going to take ATP and convert it. So this enzyme right here, this enzyme right here, is going to take ATP, convert it into another molecule called CAMP. CAMP is called a second messenger, and it's called a second messenger because whenever we talk about second messengers, these are molecules that are in the cytoplasm that are not touching the cell membrane. They're part of the signal transduction pathway in the cytoplasm. That's what a second messenger is by definition. It's in the cytoplasm. It's part of the transduction pathway in the cytoplasm. It's not one of the proteins that are associated with the cell membrane. And then CAMP is going to activate an enzyme. It's like a cascade here. It's like domino effect where this activated enzyme is going to activate another enzyme. And so this whole process in the cytoplasm is called transduction. Because what's happening is that the signal is now causing some kind of reaction in a reaction cascade inside the cytoplasm. The message is getting delivered, in a cascade fashion. So secondary messenger system, because it involves CAMP, and it causes the cell to do an action, It causes the cell to respond, and that's called response. So signal transduction pathways include signal, transduction, response. So those are basically the 3 steps in a signal transduction pathway regarding hormones that are made up of proteins, protein hormones. Let's talk about a protein hormone called epinephrine or adrenaline. Remember, these are the simple amines, the simple modified amino acid, epinephrine or adrenaline. And because it is polar hydrophilic, it will simply bind to a G protein linked receptor protein. So there's epinephrine, it binds to the receptor. And epinephrine, by the way, is released by the adrenal gland. You can kind of see it behind my head here. It's a gland, and you have 2 of them because you have 2 kidneys. They sit right on top of the 2 kidneys, And again, you can see here blood vessels connected to the adrenal gland. So when that epinephrine or adrenaline is released, it goes into your bloodstream and spreads out to target cells in your whole body, And again, we did talk about this in class, but epinephrine or adrenaline is part of the whole fight or flight response, And fight or flight response. And it is going to target your heart because the heart rate is going to go up. It's going to target some of the muscles, the intercostal muscles that are responsible for your breathing, your rib cage expanding and It's going to increase breathing, like you're nervous and you want to either fight or flight. And then it's going to, target your brain. It's going to target your, the muscles that make up the iris, causing their pupils, the pupils to, the smooth muscles that line the pupil to dilate. They're going to open up, and during your fight or flight response, your vision will temporarily improve. In this case, in this example, the target cell is the liver cell, okay? And what is it going to do for your liver? So first of all, once the epinephrine binds to the receptor protein, it's going to activate the G protein, okay? And that G protein is powered by GTP. And then the G protein will move laterally and activate this embedded enzyme. This enzyme is embedded in the phospholipid bilayer, and it happens to be called adenyl cyclase. Okay, adenyl cyclase. Adenyl cyclase is an enzyme that's going to take ATP, convert it into CAMP. Here we have our very first second messengers. Okay, our very first second messenger. And CAMP will activate protein kinase A, which is going to activate phosphorylase kinase, which is going to activate glycogen phosphorylase. And this is this transduction pathway. In the liver cell, what does epinephrine or adrenaline, how does the liver cell respond to it? Well, your liver stores glycogen, and glycogen is energy stored. And so when your life is in danger, you're in that fight or flight response, you want to have energy to either fight back or take flight, to run away. So that energy, glycogen, is going to be broken down into monosaccharides called glucose. Okay, monosaccharides, glucose. And that glucose will go into your bloodstream, and that is the response. So now you have a lot of glucose going through your bloodstream. You can utilize it in your muscle cells to either fight back or flight, okay? In cellular respiration, you're going to break down that glucose, and you're going to make ATP to power your muscles. Okay? All right, so that's the action of epinephrine or adrenaline. And as I was saying too, epinephrine or adrenaline, these are hormones, and depending on the target cell, you're going to get a different response. In the liver cell, that's our first example. In the liver cell, it's going to, this is the response in the yellow boxes, response. Okay, it's going to cause blood glucose levels to increase because the liver cell will break down the glycogen, releasing glucose into the blood. Whereas epinephrine, when it targets the smooth muscle cell of blood vessels that supplies skeletal muscles, it's going to cause that cell to relax. Okay, we're talking about the smooth muscles that line the blood vessels, okay? The smooth muscles that line the blood vessels. So those blood vessels that lead to your muscles, they will relax. And that's a good thing, because when that cell relaxes, it causes the blood vessels to dilate. And when they dilate, that means to open up wider. And so if the blood vessels are wider, it increases blood flow to those skeletal muscles. And again, epinephrine or adrenaline, this is the fight or flight hormone, and you want blood flow to increase to the skeletal muscles for a few reasons, like to either get that glucose, right? Get that glucose that came from glycogen in the liver, and it supplies that glucose, but then also it's going to supply oxygen to all of your cells, okay? And then also another example of a target cell would be the smooth muscle cells in the wall of the blood vessels that supplies intestines. So in contrast, we're contrasting skeletal muscle, blood vessels that supply skeletal muscle, to blood vessels that supply intestines. And as you guys know, your intestines is responsible for digestion and absorption of nutrients, of food that you've just eaten, okay? And when your life is in danger, the priority is not to digest food, okay? The priority is to get blood flowing to the most important parts of your body, like the heart and your skeletal muscles. So blood flow is actually going to decrease. Epinephrine is going to cause blood flow to decrease to your intestines. So the cells are going to contract. The blood vessels are going to contract, causing less blood flow to the intestines, decreasing blood flow, because it kind of makes sense for your survival. You know, you don't want all of that blood flow and glucose going to digestion. You want that blood flow to go to your muscles or to the liver to break down the glycogen. Okay? So the benefits of the second messenger system is amplification, something called amplification. Amplification is when we take one signal and we multiply it. The internal cytoplasmic response is bigger. It's amplified because that one signal molecule is going to cause a change in the receptor protein shape, and that change in shape can activate 4 different G proteins. Okay, it's sort of like a relay race, but in this case, the signal protein activates 4 people to just go out and start the race. Okay, and then each G protein is going to activate an adenyl cyclase, and then each adenyl cyclase can convert multiple ATP into CAMP. So we're amplifying it even further. And then that CAMP can activate a protein kinase, but then each protein kinase can activate another enzyme, multiple enzymes, I mean. So we're amplifying the signal, okay? And we end up with a very fast response, That one signal protein is going to cause that cell to respond very quickly because of a second messenger system where that CAMP is going to activate protein kinase, and each one can activate more enzymes, okay? And so we call that a cascade multiplier, which is going to lead to a very, very fast response. Okay, so let's start talking about like specific examples of hormones that help regulate homeostasis. But before that, we do need to talk about a little bit about like, you know, maintaining homeostasis in general. Why is it so important? You know, your body needs to maintain stable body conditions, internal stable body conditions, and that's called homeostasis, correct? Okay, so this can be applied to many things, like blood glucose levels have to be a certain level. The amount of calcium ions have to be at a certain level. The amount of, you know, chlorine ions have to be at a certain level. The amount of carbon dioxide has to be at a specific level. Oxygen at a certain level. So it really applies to so many things, okay? And why is it so important? Because in order for chemical reactions to happen in your body, there has to be a certain level of equilibrium. Or else, if it changes, then chemical reactions cannot happen. There's going to be interference. There's going to be maybe breakdown of proteins, okay? For example, if you change the pH of your blood, that's going to break down, you know, there's denaturation is going to happen. It's going to break down proteins. So we need to maintain homeostasis in order for chemical reactions to continue in our body, in order for our cells to stay alive. Okay, that's kind of like the simple answer there. So in regarding hormones, okay, hormones that help maintain homeostasis, if a specific body condition gets too high, okay, there is a gland that's going to release a hormone that's going to bring the condition back down. The body's going to respond to that hormone and bring the body condition back down. So this is an example of negative feedback, because remember with negative feedback, it stops the process from continuing. So if a condition is going higher and higher, by negative feedback, a hormone is going to be released by a gland and bring it back down to that specific body condition. So it's stopping the process from continuing. If it gets too low, there will be another gland, or maybe the same gland, depending on which hormone we're talking about. A gland will release a hormone number 2, and it's going to raise the body condition back up. So again, this is an example of the negative feedback model, which is a figure 8 model. Like if it goes too high, it's brought back down. If it gets too low, it's brought back up. Okay? And by the way, hormone 1 and 2, okay, these are what we call antagonistic, okay, They're antagonistic hormones, meaning they are opposing hormones. They do the opposite. And we will be talking about a couple of antagonistic hormones. Here's another example of negative feedback, but it's controlled by the nervous system, controlling body temperature. Okay, so our human body temperature should be about 37 degrees Celsius, which is about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, if our body temperature goes a little bit above that, okay, maybe now you have a fever of 101, okay, your hypothalamus, which was in your brain, okay, so here's your brain. This is the anterior end. This is the back side of your brain. So your eyeballs would be over here, okay? But your hypothalamus is located right in the middle, the center of your brain, deep inside your brain, okay? The hypothalamus is going to, there's blood vessels surrounding the hypothalamus. So it can detect your body temperature. And when it detects it as being too high, it will send nerve signals to cool you down. It's going to target. Those nerve signals are going to target sweat glands to start sweating. And so you will cool down by evaporative cooling. Do you remember that? When water evaporates, because water has a high heat of vaporization, when it evaporates, it's going to take away a lot of that energy that it absorbed from your body. It's going to take that energy and water is going to evaporate, taking that heat energy with it. Okay, so that's how you cool down when you sweat. Okay, and then also it's going to target, those nerve signals are going to target the blood vessels just in your skin to dilate, so the blood vessels will open up. Okay, and when the blood vessels open up, then body heat will be lost at the surface of your skin, and that's how you also cool down as well. Okay, so if you guys are exercising, you can radiate a lot of body heat, and that's due to blood vessels at the surface of your skin dilating or opening up. Okay, let's say that you have hypothermia now. So this was hyperthermia. This is hypothermia. It's going below the normal body temperature. It's the hypothalamus again that can detect the blood temperature or body temperature. And it's going to send nerve signals to your muscles to start moving around and shivering. Because when you shiver, when you move your muscles around, you burn glucose in cellular respiration. And when you burn glucose or break down glucose in cellular respiration, one of the the byproducts of it's a exergonic reaction. It's an exergonic reaction. It's where glucose is being broken down and energy is being released. Some of that energy being released is body heat. Some of that energy that's being released is body heat. Okay, so I was trying to think of it's an exergonic reaction. It's a catabolic reaction. Okay, do you guys remember those two terms? Catabolic and exergonic. Okay, energy is released. Part of that is body heat, and it warms up your body. Okay, and then also it targets those blood vessels to constrict. So constrict and dilate means the opposite. Dilate means to open up. Constrict means to become more and more narrow. And as the blood flow is stopped, as blood flow is reduced to the surface, that's good because that blood contains body heat, and you don't want blood to be flowing easily to your skin surface where that body heat will be lost. Okay, so it restricts blood flow to your skin. As a result, you can feel your skin getting numb because there's less blood flow. And also you might turn blue or purple, right? Because there's not a lot of blood flowing to your skin, okay? And in extreme cases, cells that are starved of oxygen and food due to the restriction of blood flow, those cells will die of, and that's called frostbitten, right? So that tissue will be frostbitten and those cells will die, okay? All right, now let's get into the endocrine system, the hormone system, and there are a couple of hormones that are responsible for the regulation of sugar in your blood, okay? So we're talking specifically about glucose, okay? Your glucose blood sugar levels should be around 90 milligrams per 100 mils during a fasting state. So when you're fasting, okay, and you take a blood glucose test, it should be around 90. It shouldn't be over 100, okay? It should be around 90. If it gets above that, maybe, let's say, you've just eaten lunch, and so now your body is breaking down your lunch, and glucose is being absorbed by the blood, okay? Then your blood sugar levels are going to start to go high, okay? And when it starts to go high, the pancreas is the gland that detects this, okay? The pancreas is the gland that detects this. And the pancreas is going to release a hormone. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so distracted. There's a bird just outside, just flying down into the pool. I've never seen that happen. Okay. Sorry. So the pancreas is going to release a hormone called insulin, okay? There are specific pancreatic cells that do this. I'm just going to press pause for a little bit because I think there might be something inside the pool that the bird is maybe trying to rescue. It was actually nothing. One year we had a group of birds, and they had babies, and then all of their babies fell in the pool. So I didn't want that to happen again. Okay, so insulin. So when your blood sugar levels go high, then the pancreas is the gland that detects it. Insulin is going to be released. You don't need to know like the name of the cells in the pancreas that actually release insulin, but they're called the islets of Langerhans, the beta islet cells, okay? And so what insulin is going to do is that it's going to target your body cells. And your body cells are going to, the insulin will bind to receptors on the cell membrane, and it's going to cause those body cells to take in the sugar from the blood. So what's happening is that the glucose is being removed from your blood because it's now going inside of the body cells, okay? And your body cells, when they take in the glucose, what are they going to do with it? Cellular respiration, okay? So they're going to take in, and again, the glucose came from your lunch, okay? And that makes sense. You need that lunch to make ATP and cellular respiration, okay? And insulin is vital. Insulin is important for you to be able to take the food that you're eating and tell your body cells to remove it from the blood and start using it for cellular respiration to make ATP, which is going to keep you alive. And then also your insulin is going to target your liver cells to store glucose, to remove the glucose from your blood and store it as glycogen for later, okay? And then also, and it says it's kind of blocked there, but it's going to target your brain, and it's going to reduce appetite. It says reduce appetite there, okay? So it's going to reduce the appetite. All right, but let's say that you've been fasting, and now your blood sugar levels are low. You haven't eaten for like 12 hours, and you're going to start getting hungry. But what is the hormone that causes you to get hungry? Well, it is released, this hormone that we're going to talk about next is released from the same gland called the pancreas. However, it is a different group of cells in the pancreas that make glucagon, okay, glucagon. And I was telling my students that one way to remember that glucagon, because everybody's heard of insulin. Insulin is like the hormone that everyone has heard of, but no one ever really talks about glucagon. Glucagon is the hormone when glucose is gone. So that's one way to remember. When glucose is gone, or in this case, low, when glucose is gone, glucose is low, glucagon is released by the pancreas, okay? And glucagon is going to target the liver. And again, the liver stores glycogen. So that's an easy place for your body to get glucose and get it back up, okay? And that liver is going to break down the glycogen, release glucose monomers, monosaccharides into the blood, raising it back up to 90 milligrams per 100 mils. And that also causes you to become hungry too, so glucagon. Okay? All right, let's talk about blood calcium levels. So your blood calcium levels should be about 10 milligrams per 100 mils. And calcium is a very important solute, okay? You need calcium besides building bones and strong muscles, okay, strong teeth. You also need it for muscle contraction. You need calcium ions for muscle contraction. There's so many uses of ions. I mean, it's an ion, it has a positive 2 charge, okay? So it's also going to be part of like how in your blood, the folding of proteins, right? Remember how we talked about the three-dimensional structure of protein is also going to depend on the amount of salts and solutes that are in the solution, because that can change. If it changes, then it can change the three-dimensional structure of the protein. But anyways, I just want to focus on calcium right now in terms of its levels going up. If it gets too high, let's say that you've eaten a multivitamin, and that multivitamin has a lot of calcium in it, then your thyroid gland is going to detect the high levels of calcium in your blood, and then your thyroid is going to release a hormone called calcitonin. And again, I told my students one way to remember this is calcitonin is like calcitone it down. You need to tone it down. You need to bring it down because the calcium levels are too high. Tone it down. So calcitone it down. So when calcium levels are too high, calcitone it down, okay? And it's going to bring it down. It's going to bring it down by targeting, so calcitonin, it's going to target your kidneys, okay? It's going to target your kidneys, and it's going to cause the kidneys to decrease reabsorption of calcium ions. What does that mean? It just means that when the blood gets filtered in your kidneys, because that's what your kidneys do, it filters blood and it makes urine, so that's what's happening here. Urine is being made, which will go to your bladder, and then, then you'll urinate, okay? But what it's doing here, what calcitonin does in your kidneys, is it tells your kidneys to stop absorbing calcium, just release the calcium into your urine, okay? So that kind of makes sense. Like if you take a multivitamin and you don't need the calcium, then it will just be lost in your urine, okay? And then also, if there's a lot of calcium in your blood, it could be deposited. It says calcium ions deposited in bone, okay? I mean, your bones are where calcium is stored, so if you've got extra calcium, your body will also store it in your bones, okay? Now let's say that calcium levels are too low. There are 4 parathyroid hormones embedded in the thyroid gland, okay? And parathyroid gland is going to release a hormone called PTH, or parathyroid hormone, which targets your bones to release calcium. Okay, so if your calcium levels are too low, where's an easy place to get calcium? Well, you can remove calcium from your bones. Okay, and then also increases your kidney reabsorption of calcium ions. So when blood is being filtered in your kidneys and there's some calcium in there, but the levels are low, you will not dump out that calcium in urine. You're going to hold on to that calcium in your blood. You're not going to lose it to urine, okay? Lose it in the urine. You're not going to filter it out. And then also the parathyroid hormone is going to, target your intestines to increase calcium uptake. The thing about intestines and calcium uptake, though, is that you need vitamin D to efficiently absorb calcium in the intestines, okay? You need vitamin D. And that's why oftentimes you will find milk in the store sold that it will say vitamin D fortified. It's basically been supplemented or fortified with vitamin D so that there is efficient calcium uptake in the intestines. Okay, now let's talk about, we were talking about insulin and glucagon, okay? We were talking about calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. Let's talk about 2 hormones that are very important for regulating metabolism, okay? Just in general metabolism, for regulating a lot of the chemical reactions in your body. And these hormones are called thyroxins. And thyroxins there's 2 of them. They're called T3 and T4. And on the next slide, we'll talk about why they're called T3 and T4. But thyroxins are T3, T4. And there is this pathway that produces thyroxins. It all starts in your brain. So in your brain, your hypothalamus will produce a hormone called TRH. Okay? TRH is going to target the anterior pituitary. Okay, so this is our target, anterior pituitary, which is also in your brain. Okay, it's just underneath the hypothalamus. And then the anterior pituitary is going to produce TSH. Okay, so TRH is acting on another gland, which is going to cause that gland, the anterior pituitary, to produce TSH. TSH is going to go into your blood, okay, and travel down to your thyroid. So this is our target. Okay, so TSH is going to target, that's supposed to say target, the thyroid gland. And you guys know the thyroid gland is right over here, okay, like in your neck. And the thyroid gland will then make the thyroxins T3 and T4. And thyroxins are needed for a lot of things, okay, in your body. So let me just put it all up here, like bone growth, okay, thyroxins, the T4, T3, T4 are going to help you with bone growth, mental development, metabolic use of energy, blood pressure, heart rate, muscle tone, digestion, and reproduction. So really the thyroxins does a lot in your body, T3 and T4. And to make the thyroxins, it's this whole pathway that involves 1, 2, 3. It involves 3 glands, okay? And in between, it involves 2 different hormones that is going to cause the thyroxins to be made, okay? But the regulation of the thyroxin production is called negative feedback. The way that it's regulated is by negative feedback. So think about it this way. If you're making enough T3 and T4, okay, they're going into your blood, okay, so they go into your blood. If you're making enough of it, there's like a high concentration of thyroxins in your blood. It's detected by your hypothalamus. Just like the hypothalamus detects like blood temperature, hypothalamus can also detect the amount of T3 and T4 in your blood. And if it's high enough, then it will stop secreting TRH. It will stop secreting TRH, okay? And if TRH is not made, then the anterior pituitary is not going to release TSH. TSH is not going to act on the thyroid to start making thyroxin. So, you know, this is a very efficient way that your body uses by negative feedback, regulating the amount of T3 or T4, okay? By negative feedback, it's going to stop this whole process. Another way it's done is TSH. If there's enough TSH in the blood, it's going to be detected by the hypothalamus, and TRH will not be made by, or secreted, I should say, by the hypothalamus. Okay, so this is how your body regulates the amount of T3 and T4. And why are they called T3 and T4? Well, in order to make T3 and T4, you need tyrosine amino acid, and then you need iodine. You need the element iodine, okay? And thyroxin T3, okay? T3 is made up of tyrosine and 3 iodine atoms, and then T4 is made up of 4 iodine atoms, in addition to the tyrosine amino acid, okay? So what happens though if you're not getting enough iodine in your diet? You don't naturally make iodine, okay? You need iodine in your diet. So what happens if you don't get enough of it in your diet? Your thyroid gland, which is here highlighted in pink, will actually swell up, and we call that a goiter. When there's an iodine deficiency, the thyroid is enlarged and as it tries to produce thyroxin. Okay? And so you end up with goiters. So in this case, in this picture, this person has extreme case of swollen thyroid glands, okay? So sometimes at the supermarket, you guys might see some salt that has been supplemented with iodine, okay? This is Morton salt that's iodized. So they've actually supplemented the iodine in the salt just to ensure that the population is getting enough iodine in their diet, okay? Okay, so the nervous system and the endocrine system are linked, okay? Because part of your brain, you have the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus produces a couple of hormones, but it also stimulates the pituitary gland just below it to start secreting hormones, okay? So here, deep inside our brain, we have the hypothalamus, which detects your body temperature. It's going to detect the amount of did we say calcium ions? Hold on, let me just make sure. just double check. Oh, it detects the amount of T3, T4, but then I also want to go back to, yeah, the amount of, no, not the amount of calcium. I know I said this before here. I think I was just referring to it for body temperature, huh? Okay. Yeah, so body temperature, and then also the amount of T3, T4. Okay. Okay. We're going to go through this quickly and go back to our slide where we were. And then the hypothalamus is going to send nerve impulses. So this is part of the nervous system as well. And it's going to cause the pituitary glands to like release hormones. Okay. And the pituitary gland is known as the master gland because it stores so many different hormones and releases many, many different hormones. We're not going to go over each hormone. However, in detail, I did go over the hormones in detail in class, but I'm not going to go over in detail in this video, okay? But the pituitary gland, it secretes a broad range of tropic hormones that will target other glands in the body to start producing and secreting other hormones, okay? So for example, so this is this is in the brain, this is the hypothalamus, and then this is the pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary, meaning the pituitary, that half that's in the front of your brain, is going to release a hormone called TSH, and it targets your thyroid. And then the thyroid will start making T3, T4, okay? And then also the anterior pituitary is going to target your adrenal gland, which sits on top of your kidneys. It's releasing ACTH, and it's going to target the adrenal cortex specifically to start producing some stress hormones, okay? The anterior pituitary, so, it's releasing these hormones. For example, it releases growth hormone, which targets muscles and bones to start growing. Anterior pituitary is going to release follicle-stimulating hormones and luteinizing hormones, which target the gonads like testes and ovaries. Okay, and then in this one, the anterior pituitary is going to release prolactin, which is going to target mammary glands in mammals to start producing milk. And then melanocyte-stimulating hormone, it's going to target your melanocytes to start producing melanin. Okay, in this example, it's melanocytes in amphibians, but we also have the MSH targeting our melanocytes to start making melanin. So that's the anterior pituitary. That's just some of the hormones. That's not all. This is not an extensive list, okay? And then the posterior pituitary releases two hormones. One is called oxytocin, which, remember in class I called it the love hormone. It's my most favorite hormone because it does so many amazing things, okay? It's going to target the uterus to contract and push a baby out of the uterus when it's time, okay? And then also the posterior pituitary releases ADH, the antidiuretic hormone, which targets your kidneys to reabsorb water, okay? So I mentioned prolactin, okay? I mentioned prolactin and oxytocin. Those are two hormones that are part of a positive feedback response, okay? Prolactin and oxytocin are part of a positive feedback response. So remember, negative feedback stops a process, whereas positive feedback encourages a process, causes a process to continue until completion, until, it's reached a certain state, okay? And so we're going to be talking about lactation and labor, but first let's talk about labor. Okay, let's talk about labor. So here we have, the little fetus. It's growing so big. It's so big now, like at 9 months, that its head is in position where its head is pushing up against the cervix. Okay, so here's the cervix. Here's the vaginal canal. So this is the path that the little, fetus or baby is going to come out. Okay, and when its head is pushing up against the cervix, okay, this is the head of the baby pushes against the cervix, the nerve impulses from the cervix sends a message to the brain, to the mother's brain, okay? And then the brain, the pituitary gland, starts to secrete oxytocin. And remember what I said, oxytocin targets the uterus. it's going to cause the uterus to contract. Okay, so the oxytocin in the endocrine system, it's going to travel through the bloodstream to the uterus, causing uterine contraction. And the brain will secrete oxytocin consistently, and contractions will come on consistently, right, until she's ready to push the baby out. Okay, once the baby is pushed out, that's the end of the process. And so, but it doesn't stop there, because oxytocin will also be released during lactation. Okay, lactation is the production of milk, right? And so we have in pituitary gland, we have oxytocin. In this case, oxytocin not only is going to target the uterus, but it also causes the mammary glands to release milk. Okay, oops, I spelled release wrong. Okay, so oxytocin causes the release of milk, whereas prolactin in the anterior pituitary causes milk production. Okay, it causes the milk to be made, and then oxytocin along with prolactin causes release. Okay, but how does this happen? Like, how does prolactin and oxytocin continue to be released by the pituitary gland? It's by suckling. The action of suckling as the newborn baby, it's an innate behavior. You don't have to teach babies to suckle. Unless some babies that are born premature, they do have a hard time suckling. But babies that are born around their due date, their instinct is to suckle. And so they will turn their head. It's amazing. They just know to turn their head and suckle. And the motion, the action of suckling sends a nerve impulse to the brain. Okay. And the pituitary gland will start releasing prolactin and oxytocin. Okay. And also, I did say oxytocin targets the uterus. So mothers will say that as they are breastfeeding, they're making that oxytocin because it's the hormone that causes you to release blood, but it also targets the uterus. So mothers will say that as you're breastfeeding their baby, they will feel cramping. The uterus is cramping, it's contracting. Okay. So again, it really depends on the target cell, right? I mean, that hormone is being released into the bloodstream, and it's going to target cells, which include the uterus, not just the mammary glands. Okay, and then we're going to go through this really quickly because I did go over this in great detail in class, and it really is just a lot of information. So I'm just going to put all this information up and then just quickly go over it. Okay, so biologically, the female body is going to produce a lot of hormones, a lot of hormones. And the whole purpose of all these hormones is to obtain or achieve pregnancy, okay? But as a high school student, that is not your goal, that is not your drive, okay? But you're evolutionarily speaking, your body is trying to achieve pregnancy. So it is releasing all these hormones at certain, parts of your 28-day cycle. During the 28-day cycle, there's all these hormones that are being released, trying to get you ready for pregnancy, okay? So the first one is GnRH, which is going to be released by the hypothalamus, which causes the release of FSH and LH by the pituitary gland, which is going to go into your blood, right? It's going to be released into the blood, which is going to flow down to your ovaries, and then your ovaries are going to start making estrogen. And then estrogen is going to cause usually one egg to mature a month and be released, causing ovulation, in the process of ovulation. And also the uterus not only causes an egg to be released in ovulation, but it also encourages the uterine lining or the endometrium to become really thick. Okay, so the uterine lining or the endometrium gets really thick. There's a whole tissue and blood system in the uterine lining that builds up. It gets really thick so that the little, zygote that's made can bury itself in there, can dig itself in there. Okay, so right after the estrogen is released, then this is the ovary. This is a picture of the ovary. The corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is where the egg came from. That's where the egg matured, and it was released from this area. It's called the corpus luteum. That tissue starts to release progesterone, and then progesterone maintains the uterine lining that estrogen built up. So estrogen built up the uterine lining, and then progesterone will maintain it. And then, if there's a fertilized egg, so if pregnancy is achieved, that little zygote is going to bury itself in the uterine lining. And when it buries itself in the uterine lining, the zygote starts to produce a hormone called HCG. So HCG is not a hormone that's made by the mother. The HCG is made by the zygote. It produces a hormone that gets into her bloodstream, okay? Goes into her bloodstream, and that is actually what pregnancy tests detect. A pregnancy test will test for HCG. As HCG is in her blood, and that blood gets filtered in the kidneys, and she's making urine, the HCG will end up in her urine, okay? And HCG will act, it's going to target the corpus luteum, okay? And it's going to target the corpus luteum to continue to produce progesterone, because what does progesterone do? It maintains the uterine lining. And again, that's what the zygote wants. It wants to have a thick uterine lining to continue getting food and oxygen from the mother, okay? So this is a lot of hormones we're talking about that are part of the female reproductive cycle, and the amount of hormones going in a 28-day cycle goes up and down, and partially that it can be responsible for premenstrual syndrome or PMS. Okay, the amount of hormones going up and down can explain why some women experience PMS. Okay, all right, now we're going to move on to the nervous system. So the nervous system is a system of neurons communicating with each other. Okay, so here's a picture of one neuron, and then here's a picture of another neuron. This neuron on the left is communicating to the one on the right. And I always feel like neurons have the most strange shape, because, so far when we've talked about cells, an animal cell is circular, a plant cell is square or rectangular. But really, it depends on the type of cell it is, right? Muscle tissue is usually long, okay? Long, it's more like this, okay? Whereas nervous tissue made up of neurons have this very strange shape, okay? So let's talk about a neuron. A neuron, where it receives information. So information is coming in from other neurons. Information is coming in at the dendrite. So there's information, and it can actually be communicating with hundreds of other neurons, okay? And then once it receives information at the dendrite, so these are called dendrites, electrical impulses are going to move down to the cell body. The cell body is where the nucleus is found. The cell body is where mitochondria are found. The cell body is where the Golgi apparatus, the ER, rough and smooth, that's where all of the organelles are found in the cell body. And then once the electrical impulse reaches the cell body, then it's going to move down the axon. Okay, it's going to move down this axon, and then it's going to reach the axon terminal. Once the electrical impulse gets to the axon terminal, that axon terminal is going to release these chemical signals. These chemical signals called neurotransmitters. Okay, remember we said that at the very beginning of this video that the ligand or the chemical signal for the nervous system are called neurotransmitters, and that's going to be used to communicate between this neuron and then the next neuron. Excuse me. So going back to this picture, this neuron, an electrical impulse will move down the axon. Once it reaches the axon terminal, what does it look like? What's happening? And here's a blow-up picture of it. That electrical impulse will reach the axon terminal. It's going to cause these vesicles that are holding neurotransmitters to release the neurotransmitters into this small space. This small space is called a synapse or synaptic cleft, okay? So these two neurons or cells are not touching. They're not touching. They are communicating. They're communicating with each other, but there's a very small space between them. And those neurotransmitters are going to bind to receptor proteins, just like how we talked about epinephrine. epinephrine like binding to receptor protein. But in this case, something else is going to happen. There's no signal transduction cascade. Instead, once the neurons, neurotransmitters bind to these signal molecule receptor proteins, there's going to be a change in ion concentration in the what we call the postsynaptic cell. So this is the synapse. Okay, this gap is called the synapse. This is the presynaptic cell, like before the synapse, and then the receiving cell is called the postsynaptic cell. Okay. So I would have asked you, like, what is this an example of? Is this an example how neurons communicate? Is it autocrine, signaling across gap junctions? Is it paracrine, or is it endocrine? And hopefully you guys see that it's a type of paracrine signaling where a cell is going to communicate with another cell that is nearby. And in fact, there's a small gap between the signaling cell and the target cell, and that gap is called the synapse, okay? Okay, how do cells communicate? An example of how the neurons communicate would be a reflex arc, okay? As you know, a reflex is a very quick response. You don't even have to think about it. That's the whole, point of it, why it's called a reflex. You don't have to think about it. It just happens, okay, without even thinking about it. There's 3 main neurons involved in a reflex arc: the sensory neuron, interneuron, and motor neuron. The interneuron is found in your spinal cord, okay? The sensory neuron is, the sensory neuron is found, on the skeletal, near the skeletal muscle. It's found in your skin. It senses your surroundings. And then the motor neuron is going to send an impulse to your muscles, causing the muscle to move. And that's why it's called a motor neuron, because it's a neuron that is communicating to muscle to move, okay? Let me show you actually a better example of a reflex arc. So this is a reflex arc. And the reason why it's called an arc is because it goes in one direction and then out the other, okay? So let's say you touch something super sharp or something very hot. A sensory neuron is going to sense that and then send a message to your spinal cord. This is your spinal cord dissection of the spinal cord. There's an interneuron here that's going to be the, I guess you could say, the middleman. It's the middle neuron in between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. The interneuron is going to send a message immediately to the motor neuron to cause the muscles to contract, moving your hand away from the point of harm, So it could be something sharp or something hot, okay? So a sensory neuron, you touch a cactus or needle. The spinal cord interneuron, not a brain interneuron, okay? It's in your spine, which is going to send a message to your motor neuron to move your hand away very quickly. And actually, this is very important that it's not in your brain, okay? Because your spine is much more closer to your hand, okay? Whereas if the message from your hand goes to your brain and you have to process the information in your brain and think about it, then your hand will be on the, on the very sharp object or on the very hot surface for a long period of time, and you could end up harming yourself even further. So reflex is where you do not have to think about it, because the interneuron that communicates between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron is in the spine, okay? And usually, when you injure yourself, like you touch something super hot and you move your hand away, you realize what happened after the fact, after you moved your hand away. That's a reflex. You don't have to think about it. You just do it because it doesn't involve your brain. Your brain will perceive what happened afterwards, but your brain is not responsible for moving your hand away, okay? So your brain is not responsible for moving your hand away. Your brain is responsible for perceiving what just happened, okay? And maybe in this case, learning your lesson not to do it again, or just to be careful. So the information that flows through the neuron, let's talk about how, an electrical impulse will move through a neuron. Information comes in through the dendrites where they collect electrical signals, okay? Actually, the neurotransmitters, those are the signal molecules. They'll actually bind to, the dendrites, okay? Or they could be another neuron can be connected to the cell body and a neurotransmitter is released, okay? And then the information, electrical impulse will move down due to neurotransmitters being received. An electrical impulse will move down from the dendrites to the cell body and then move through the axon. Axon is where the electrical signals pass to the next neuron or postsynaptic neuron, okay? So information is received, number one, at the dendrite, then the cell body, axon, and then axon endings or axon terminals, okay? So let's talk about what is this electrical impulse that we're talking about. Well, first of all of your cells, including neurons, have a negative charge inside, okay? When you compare the inside to the outside of every cell, okay, every cell, when you compare, there's an electrochemical gradient. Okay, there's an electrochemical gradient. I wish I can, I'm going to spell this out. Electrochemical, actually I might have it in gradient. If I press the key, I think it might even pop up, so I don't really need to set, yeah. Yes, okay, it's it. So it is, so remember when we say gradient, there's a difference across the cell membrane. There's a difference in charge across the cell membrane. It's negative inside, it's positive outside. Why is that? Well, simply put, I mean, it's partly due to the sodium-potassium pump, but you just have more negative ions called anions in the cytoplasm. Like there's a whole lot of chlorine ions, okay? On the outside, there is much more sodium ions. There's a ton of sodium positive ions outside. There's a few, you know, there's more potassium ions inside than outside. But overall, there's a lot of sodium ions and positive ions outside, in addition to more negative ions on the inside. Okay, but the sodium-potassium pump, what that protein does, remember it's a protein, so maybe I'll draw a cell here, and then it's a protein that's going to pump 3 sodium ions out, and it's going to pump 2 potassium ions in. So like overall, you're just getting more positive charges being pumped out than coming in. 3 versus 2, right? So internally, you're going to have a more negative charge than the outside, okay? And in fact, when you take a voltmeter and you measure the amount of electrical charge or voltage in the cell, it's minus 70 millivolts. It's minus 70 millivolts, okay? So, along the cell, there's, you have the phospholipid bilayer. Along the neuron, you have the phospholipid bilayer. And then you have many different ion channels. A lot of different ion channels. These are proteins that transport ions, right? That's what we learned about in chapter 6 or something. I forget. We talked about the cell membrane. There are a lot of ion channels along the whole entire surface of this neuron, okay? Some of those ion channels are the sodium-potassium pump. And then some of those are potassium ion channels. And then some of those are sodium ion channels, okay? So the sodium-potassium pump, it pumps 3 sodium ions out and then 2 potassium ions in. But then the sodium channels can also pump, or not pump, when they open up, actually, they will allow for passive facilitated diffusion, okay? So when the sodium ion channels open up, then the sodium will rush in because there's a higher concentration gradient of sodium out here. So think of it this way. So if there's a lot of sodiums out here and the sodium ion channel opens up, they're going to come in because there's a higher concentration of sodium outside, okay? Whereas when you look at the potassium ions are inside. When the potassium ion channels open up, they're going to go out because there's a higher concentration of potassium inside the cell, okay? So when the potassium ion channels and the sodium ion channels open up, they're going to move to the opposite side because there's a higher concentration gradient, okay? So what's happening in an electrical impulse? In an electrical impulse, there's going to be a change in charge, okay? Remember how we said that inside the neuron, it's negatively charged, it's a negative charge, okay? But when there's an electrical impulse or stimulation on this neuron, the first thing that's going to happen are those sodium ion channels are going to open up. Those are going to open up. And because there's a high concentration of sodium outside, they're going to come in. They're going to come in, okay? And when they come in, what happens to the charge inside the cell there? It becomes positive, okay? So the inside becomes positive. And then once this portion becomes positive, it's going to cause the sodium ion channels in the next part of the axon to open up. And once this part of the axon is positive, it's going to cause the neighboring cell membrane, those sodium ion channels, to open up. So this positive charge internally just continues along the axon, okay? And then there's also something called saltatory conduction, where the positive charges coming in jump from what we call nodes of Ranvier, okay? Basically, I didn't talk about it earlier, but some axons are myelinated. Myelin, okay? Myelin is basically is where you have these fatty cells that wrap around the axons, and it acts as insulation. And so when you have these myelinated sheath, okay, where it insulates the axon, there's like little gaps in between the myelin, and the positive charges will jump between those open segments where there's no myelin. So it'll jump from here to there, and then the positive charges will jump. And so saltatory conduction is faster than continuous conduction, but they're both very fast in terms of electrical impulse moving down the axon. Okay, so like I said, these ion channels, when they open up, the ions will move down their concentration gradient. Okay, so here's a picture when there's a stimulus coming into the neuron. As the stimulus moves down the axon, what actually is happening? What do I mean by stimulus? It's actually called an action potential, where those sodium ion channels open up, sodium ions come in. See how there's a positive charges on this part of the axon? And that's going to cause the next section of the axon right over here, the next section, those sodium ion channels here are going to open up, and then the sodium ions come in. And then the sodium ions come in the next section. Okay, and then how does it get back to being positive? You know, once the sodium ion channels open up, then the potassium ions, it's sort of like a relay, okay? After the sodium ion channels open up, then the potassium ion channels open up. It's always sodium ions first. Sodium ions open up first. Sorry, the sodium ion channels open up first, letting sodium come in, making the cell positive. And then the potassium ion channels open up, causing the potassiums to go out, because there's more potassium inside. And they're going to go out. And as the potassium ions go out, it's going to cause the inside of the axon to become more negative, right? Because it's losing positive charges. Okay? So, you know, sodium, remember sodium, you find a high concentration of sodium outside the cell, whereas you find a high concentration of potassium ions high inside the cell. So when the sodium ion channels open up, sodium rushes in, and then the cell becomes positive. And then afterwards, the potassium ions open up, causing potassium to go out, and now you're losing positive charges. Okay, now you're losing those positive charges, and now it's becoming more negative inside the cell. Okay, so this graph you might see on the AP exam. I mean, I've seen it a couple times, okay? It's just showing you the membrane potential or the millivoltage that is being recorded, okay? So, for example, you know, the sodium-potassium pump is working. It's pumping 3 sodiums out, 2 potassiums in. Remember how I said if you recorded the voltage of a cell, it would be at minus 70. So this is what this red line is showing. The resting potential is minus 70. And then when there's a small electrical impulse, depolarization takes place. Depolarization is when the very first sodium ions open up. And when the very first sodium ions open up, sodium rushes into the cell, causing it to become more positive. You guys, this is the 0 right here. This is the 0 point. So now it's moving to more positive. Do you guys see that? Now it's like at minus 55. Minus 55 is more positive than negative 70, right? And then once it reaches minus 55 millivolts, it reaches its threshold, meaning it's going to cause a ton of sodium ion channels just to open up. It's what we call the point of no return. All of those sodium ion channels are going to open up, and it's going to allow for sodium ions to just rush into the axon. And that's called an action potential when it reaches its highest potential. Okay? And when it reaches its highest potential, it's around, if this is positive, 50, then maybe it's around positive 30 millivolts, okay? And then remember what I said, after the sodium ions open up, the potassium ions open up. That's part 4 or step 4. That's where the potassium ions open up. That's when potassium ions come in. So now it's coming into this, it's going out, okay? It's going out. The potassium ions are going out. And they are a positive charge, so they're going out. And so now the cell's becoming more and more negative. That's what's happening here, okay? And as the potassium ion channels are opening up and the potassium ions are going out, the sodium ion channels close. So really the only ions that are, traveling across the cell membrane are potassium, and they're going out. And that's why you see step 5, it's called the undershoot, because those potassium ion channels are still open. There is a ton of potassium ions that are going out. It's more and more negative. It goes below the resting potential of minus 70. And then finally, it reaches the resting potential because the sodium potassium pump gets it back to where it needs to be at about minus 70 degrees, minus 70 millivolts, okay? So what happens when that action potential reaches the synapse? So, the sodium ions are coming in, right, making it positive. And then afterwards, the potassium ions are going out, right? So the potassium ions are going out, making it back to negative. But as the action potential arrives at the axon terminal, once it becomes positive here, then it causes the calcium ion channels to open up. You guys, this is only happening at the axon terminal, okay? The calcium ion channels open up. And when they open up, calcium gets transported into the axon terminal. These calcium ions will actually bind to these vesicles that are holding the neurotransmitters. And it causes the vesicles to, by exocytosis, release those neurotransmitters. And then those neurotransmitters will bind to the receptors. Do you guys see, these are receptor proteins? They're attached to them. But they also happen to be an ion channel, okay? So maybe I can just draw it here. This is what it looks like. It's an ion channel, but it's also a receptor. So the neurotransmitter will bind here, and once it binds, then the ion channel is going to open up, and guess what's going to come in? Sodium ions. Sodium ions are going to come in. And when sodium ions come into this cell, okay, sodium ions are going to come in, what's going to happen to it? It's going to become more and more positively charged. That's what we call depolarization. That's where there's going to be an action potential, an electrical impulse, okay? So that's what's happening here. The neurotransmitters bind to these receptor proteins, which happen to be an ion channel. Sodium ions are going to rush in. Okay, you can see that here. Sodium ions are rushing in. Okay? Okay, I think that is it. Oh, okay, so I hope that wasn't too long. And I don't know. I like this topic, the endocrine system and the nervous system. I hope that you learned a lot. I like this topic because I think it's important and it's very interesting. Okay? All right, guys, have a wonderful day.